The blue lights hit your rear-view mirror before your brain even catches up. For a split second, you think maybe they're for someone else. Then the siren chirps, short, sharp, unmistakable, and your stomach drops. You ease off the gas, your hands suddenly feel too big for the steering wheel, and every little thing you did in the last 5 minutes starts replaying in your head. Was I speeding? Did I miss a sign? Why is he pulling me over? You glance again. The cruiser is right behind you now. And then, before you've even fully processed the stop itself, a much darker thought creeps in. One that most people don't like to admit they've had. What if this turns into something more? Let me ask you something straight up. Have you ever been in a traffic stop where things felt like they could go sideways fast? Where the officer's tone changed, the questions got sharper, or the situation suddenly felt tense? If you have, I want you to share that experience in the comments, because what you felt in that moment matters more than you probably realize. And later in this discussion, I'm going to explain why that feeling can actually influence how officers interpret your behavior. Now here's where we need to get serious. The question people ask, sometimes quietly, sometimes out loud, is this: if police officers are shooting at you, can you legally shoot back? It sounds like something out of a movie. It feels extreme. But it's not a crazy question. It comes from a real place: fear, confusion, and a misunderstanding of how the law actually works in high-pressure, fast-moving situations. And I'm going to tell you right now, without sugarcoating it, in almost every real-world scenario, the answer is no. And acting on the belief that you can is one of the fastest ways to make a situation irreversible. But that's not the whole story, and if you stop listening there, you'll miss the part that actually keeps you safe. Because the truth is buried in how the law defines force, how officers are trained to react, and how quickly a situation can shift from a routine stop to something life-altering. Let's walk through what really happens. Picture this: you've pulled over, engine off, hands on the wheel, you're doing everything right. The officer approaches, maybe a little slow, maybe watching your hands closely. Evening, license and registration, normal so far. But then something changes. Maybe your voice shakes a little when you respond. Maybe you reach for your glove compartment a bit too quickly. Maybe your passenger says something out of turn. The officer's tone tightens. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." That right there, that moment, is where things begin to branch. Officers are trained to read behavior, not just words. They are watching your hands, your breathing, your eye movement. They are not just listening to what you say. They are interpreting how you say it. And here's the part most people don't understand. Hesitation can look like concealment. Nervousness can look like guilt. Silence can sometimes escalate suspicion, depending on how it's delivered. Now imagine things escalate further. Step out of the vehicle. You hesitate. Maybe you ask why. Maybe you're thinking about your rights. Maybe you've seen videos online telling you to question everything. The officer repeats the command, this time louder. "Step out of the vehicle now." At this point, legally, you are required to comply. That's not optional in the moment. You can challenge it later, in court, but roadside is not where that argument gets resolved. Now let's push this scenario further into the uncomfortable territory people don't like to think about. What if you hear something? Maybe the officer calling for backup, maybe something that sounds more urgent than it should be. What if another officer arrives quickly and now their positioning changes? What if hands go near holsters? This is where imagination starts to fill in gaps, and that's dangerous. Because the law does not operate on what you think is happening. It operates on what can be proven about what actually happened. So let's talk about the core legal principle here. In the United States, self-defense laws generally allow you to use force, even deadly force, if you reasonably believe you are facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. That's the standard. But here's the catch that changes everything. When the person you're dealing with is a police officer acting under color of law, that standard becomes incredibly difficult to meet. Why? Because courts give officers a wide margin of authority when it comes to using force, especially if they can articulate that they perceive the threat. So now flip the perspective. If an officer fires their weapon, they're going to have to justify it later. They'll say what they saw, what they believed, what they feared. Maybe they'll say you reached suddenly. Maybe they'll say you ignored commands. Maybe they'll say they believed you had a weapon. Now imagine you fire back. From a legal standpoint, you are now the person who used deadly force against law enforcement. Even if you believed, truly believed, that your life was in danger, the burden on you to prove that belief was reasonable is enormous. And here's where reality hits harder than theory. In that moment, there is no judge, no jury, no legal debate. There is only reaction. Officers are trained to respond to deadly threats with overwhelming force, not equal force, overwhelming force. So if you shoot, you are almost certainly escalating the situation beyond recovery. And that's why, in practical terms, not just legal theory, the idea of shooting back is not a viable path to safety. Now, let's address the myth that floats around online. Some people believe there are rare circumstances where you can legally defend yourself against police, especially if the officer is acting unlawfully. And technically, yes, there have been cases, very rare, highly specific cases, where courts have acknowledged the right to self-defense against unlawful use of force by an officer. But those cases are not what people think they are. They don't happen in split-second roadside shootings. They don't involve unclear, chaotic situations where facts are disputed. They usually involve extreme, unmistakable misconduct, situations where it's clear beyond doubt that the officer was not acting within any legal authority. And even then, the legal battle that follows is long, uncertain, and often devastating. So when someone says, you have the right to defend yourself, they're not wrong in principle, but they're dangerously incomplete in practice. Because rights don't protect you in the moment, outcomes do. Let's go back to the traffic stop. You're standing outside your car now. The officer is asking questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Simple questions, right? But they're not just making conversation. They're building a behavioral profile. They're looking for inconsistencies. They're watching your tone. If your answers don't line up, or if your delivery raises suspicion, they may start probing deeper. Now imagine you decide to stay silent. That's your right, absolutely. But silence has to be handled carefully. If you go silent in a way that feels confrontational, refusing to speak, staring, not acknowledging commands, it can escalate tension. If you calmly say, I prefer not to answer any questions, and then remain composed, that's very different. Same right, different perception. And perception matters more than people realize, because perception influences how officers justify their actions later. Now let's talk about one of the most common turning points in these encounters. The moment an officer thinks you might be armed. It doesn't take much. A quick movement toward the center console, reaching under the seat, even adjusting your waistband in the wrong way. That's all it can take. From your perspective, it might be harmless. From theirs, it can trigger a life or death response. And once that switch flips, everything speeds up. Commands get louder, movements get sharper, and the margin for misunderstanding disappears. This is why so many encounters that start as routine end in tragedy. Not because someone planned it, but because both sides interpreted the same moment differently. Now circle back to the original question. If shots are fired, can you shoot back? Legally, you'd have to prove that a reasonable person in your exact situation would believe they were facing unlawful, imminent, deadly force, and that your response was necessary. Practically, you're trying to make that argument after surviving an encounter that has already escalated beyond control. And that's the part most people overlook. The goal is not to win a legal argument later. The goal is to never reach that moment at all. So what actually helps? Control. Not control over the officer, but control over yourself, your hands, your voice, your movements. Slow everything down, even when your heart is racing. If you need to reach for something, say it first. I'm going to grab my registration from the glove box. Wait for acknowledgement. Move deliberately. These small things feel unnecessary until they're not. And here's something else people don't talk about enough. Officers are human. They bring their own stress, fatigue, and prior experiences into every stop. If they've had a recent encounter that went bad, their threshold for perceived threat might be lower. That doesn't make it fair, but it makes it real. And understanding that can help you navigate the situation more effectively. Now, let's address passengers because they often complicate things. You might be calm, but your passenger isn't. They start talking. Why are you pulling us over? Do you even have a reason? Now the officer's attention splits. They're trying to monitor multiple people, multiple voices. That increases tension immediately. If you're the driver, you need to manage that energy. Because from the officer's perspective, they don't know who might become a threat. And that uncertainty pushes them toward caution, and sometimes toward escalation. Another overlooked moment is document handling. When an officer takes your license and registration and then holds on to them longer than you expect, people get anxious. They start asking questions. Am I being detained? Can I leave? Those questions aren't wrong, but timing matters. If you push too early, it can shift the tone of the interaction. And once tone shifts, everything becomes more rigid, more formal, less flexible. Now imagine all of this happening under the worst possible condition: confusion. You don't understand why you were stopped. The officer isn't explaining much. Commands feel abrupt. Your mind starts filling in gaps. And that's where dangerous assumptions form. Because once you start believing something extreme is happening, your behavior changes. And your behavior is exactly what the officer is reacting to. That feedback loop, your fear influencing your actions, their interpretation influencing their response, that's how situations spiral. And in that spiral, the idea of shooting back isn't a legal strategy. It's the final collapse of communication. Once you reach that point, there's no more dialogue, only reaction. So instead of asking whether you can shoot back, the better question is how you prevent ever being in a position where that thought feels relevant. That comes down to awareness, knowing how officers interpret behavior, understanding how quickly situations escalate, recognizing that your rights exist, but how you exercise them matters just as much as the rights themselves. Because the roadside is not a courtroom, it's a dynamic, unpredictable environment where small decisions carry enormous weight. And the people who navigate it best aren't the ones who know the most legal phrases. They're the ones who stay composed under pressure, who understand timing, who recognize that sometimes the smartest move isn't asserting power, it's maintaining control, not over the officer, over the situation, and most importantly, over themselves. Because once control is lost, everything else follows.